A waitress says to the mafia boss, "Hi, sir. My mother has a tattoo just like yours." But what happened next shocked everyone. The prestigious Golden Crown restaurant fell silent as Joseph Salvini, Chicago's most feared mafia boss, stared at the young waitress, his face turning white as paper, then flushed, then white again. The tattoo in question was a unique constellation pattern that wrapped around his wrist, a design he had created with only one other person over 20 years ago. His mind raced back to the summer of 2004, to a woman named Rose, who had simply vanished from his life after what he believed was a miscarriage that had ended their future together. Joseph's bodyguards tensed, misinterpreting his shock as threat, hands moving toward concealed weapons until he raised a single finger to halt them. The waitress, Audrey, according to her name tag, stood frozen, suddenly aware she'd said something significant. "Your mother," Joseph finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is her name?" The question hung in the air as the young woman clutched her serving tray tighter, her knuckles turning white with pressure. Audrey hesitated, eyes darting around at the sea of expensive suits and questioning glances before answering. "Rose Bennett, sir." The glass of scotch in Joseph's hand crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces across the imported Italian marble. "How old are you?" he asked, though something in his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. His heart pounded so hard he was certain everyone at his table could hear it hammering against his chest, like a prisoner demanding release. 20, sir," Audrey replied, growing increasingly uncomfortable as Joseph's associates exchanged concerned glances. She took a step back, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake mentioning something so personal to such a powerful man. Joseph stood abruptly, towering over his half-eaten meal, napkin falling forgotten to the floor. "Where is she now?" he demanded, voice cracking with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades of building his empire. The other diners at nearby tables pretended not to notice the unfolding drama, but their furtive glances and hushed whispers told a different story. Joseph Salvini's reputation preceded him throughout Chicago, a man whose mere presence commanded respect, and whose anger had destroyed lives and businesses alike. Audrey's hands trembled slightly as she balanced her tray, caught between her professional training and the strange magnetic pull she felt toward this dangerous stranger. Something about his eyes, haunted, searching, familiar, made her pause when every instinct screamed at her to walk away. The restaurant manager rushed over, apologizing profusely for what he assumed was poor service. Joseph silenced him with a look that could freeze blood, his focus never leaving the young woman standing before him with familiar hazel eyes he should have recognized immediately. "Tell me where you live," he said, not as a threat, but with an urgency that surprised everyone at the table, including his most trusted lieutenant, who had never seen such raw emotion from his boss in 15 years of service. Audrey's chin lifted slightly, a flash of defiance in her eyes. "With all due respect, sir, I don't think my mother would want me giving our address to someone I just met, no matter how well connected you might be in this city." Joseph pulled out his wallet, not for money, but for a faded photograph he'd kept hidden for 20 years. "Does your mother still have this small birthmark behind her right ear?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper as he showed Audrey an old Polaroid of a young woman with the same constellation tattoo. The silence that followed was deafening as Audrey's eyes widened in recognition. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered, her serving tray trembling in her hands as the implications began to dawn on her. "I need to see her," Joseph said, no longer a request, but a desperate plea from a man who suddenly realized he might have lost much more than he had ever known. "Please, there are things that happened, things I was told, that might not be true." The young waitress looked at the powerful man before her, seeing for the first time beyond the expensive suit and fearsome reputation to something broken and human. "My shift ends at 9, she finally said, writing an address on her order pad. "But I'm warning you, she might not want to see you after all this time. Chicago, 2004. The summer air hung heavy with promise, as Joseph Salvini, heir to the city's most powerful crime family, spotted Rose Bennett reading poetry in Grant Park. She wore cut-off jeans and a university sweatshirt, worlds away from the polished women who typically sought his attention. "What are you reading?" he had asked, surprising himself with his interest. Rose looked up, unimpressed by his designer clothes or the 2 bodyguards hovering discreetly nearby, and showed him her worn copy of Pablo Neruda's love sonnets. Their romance blazed like wildfire, intense, consuming, and against all reason. Rose, a nursing student from a working-class family, knew who the Salvinis were, but saw beyond Joseph's notorious family to the man who quoted poetry and dreamed of legitimacy. "We'll leave this all behind," Joseph promised one night, as they lay beneath the stars at his lake house, tracing the constellation pattern they'd designed together. "My father's business, the family name, none of it matters compared to what I feel for you." For 3 perfect months, Joseph kept Rose separate from his world, meeting her between family obligations and the increasing pressure from his father to take his rightful place in the organization. She became his escape, his glimpse of a different life where choices weren't predetermined by blood. The pregnancy test changed everything. 2 pink lines that represented both dream and nightmare collided as Rose showed Joseph the result with tears in her eyes, uncertain if they were from joy or fear. "My father will never accept this," Joseph said, pacing the small apartment Rose shared with 2 other nursing students. "He has plans for me to marry into the Donato family, to strengthen our position against rivals from the east side." His father's reaction was worse than he'd imagined. "Get rid of it," Don Salvini had commanded, slamming his fist on the mahogany desk that had witnessed 3 generations of family decisions. "Or I'll make sure she disappears permanently. Your choice." Joseph gave Rose money for an abortion, tears streaming down his face as he explained the impossible situation. "I can't protect you from my father," he admitted, shame burning his throat like acid. "He'll never let us be a family." The hotel room where they met for the last time became a mausoleum for their dreams, walls closing in as Rose clutched the envelope of cash with white knuckles. Outside, rain pounded against the windows, nature itself mourning what they were about to lose. Later that night, alone in his father's study, Joseph smashed his fist through an antique mirror, the physical pain a welcome distraction from the hollow ache in his chest. The Don watched impassively from his leather chair, a glass of scotch in one hand, satisfaction evident in his cold, calculating eyes. 2 weeks later, Rose called him from a payphone, voice hollow and distant. "I lost the baby," she said, refusing to meet in person. "It's over, Joseph. Don't try to find me. Your world and mine were never meant to intersect." He respected her wishes, drowning his grief in work and eventually taking his place as his father's right hand. The old Don died 3 years later, leaving Joseph to build the empire into something more powerful and sophisticated, though the hole in his heart remained unfilled. Never once had he suspected she had lied about the miscarriage. Never once had he imagined that somewhere in this city, his child had been growing up without him, carrying half his DNA and none of his burdens. As he sped toward the address Audrey had given him, Joseph realized how completely Rose had outmaneuvered him. She had protected their child from his world in the only way she could, by making him believe that world didn't exist. The apartment building was in a modest but respectable neighborhood on the city's northwest side. Joseph dismissed his driver, standing alone on the sidewalk for the first time in decades, staring up at the 3rd-floor windows where warm light spilled out into the gathering darkness. The knock on the door came at exactly 9:30 p.m. Rose Bennett froze at the familiar sound. 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones, a pattern she hadn't heard in 20 years but instantly recognized. Her medical textbooks lay scattered across the small dining table where she'd been studying for her nurse practitioner exam. "Mom," Audrey called from the hallway. "There's someone here to see you." The careful neutrality in her daughter's voice told Rose everything she needed to know before she even opened the door to find Joseph Salvini standing in her modest apartment, looking both powerful and somehow lost. The silence between them stretched like an eternity, 20 years of unspoken words hanging in the air between 2 people who had once known every inch of each other's souls. Joseph broke first, his eyes never leaving her face as he said, "You lied to me about our child." "I protected our child," Rose corrected, chin raised in defiance despite the trembling in her hands. "Your father threatened to make me disappear if I didn't end the pregnancy. Do you think I believed for 1 second that a man who would kill his grandchild would hesitate to kill me once I was no longer carrying it?" Joseph flinched, as if physically struck, the truth in her words impossible to deny. "You could have told me after my father died," he said, eyes darting to Audrey, who stood watching this exchange with growing understanding. "That was 17 years ago, Rose. And by then you were Chicago's most feared man, with rivals and federal agents watching your every move," Rose countered, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. "Should I have brought our daughter into that spotlight? Painted a target on her back for every enemy you've made?" Audrey stepped forward, interrupting what was quickly becoming a heated argument. "I think I deserve to be part of this conversation considering it's my existence you're discussing," she said, her voice steady, Despite the emotional earthquake reshaping her understanding of her own history, Joseph turned to really look at his daughter, their daughter, seeing now the perfect blend of his features and roses in her face. "I would have given you everything," he said quietly, addressing both of them. "Security, education, protection, anything you needed." The small apartment suddenly felt suffocating, decades of secrets and lies hanging in the air between them. On the wall, a framed photo of Audrey's high school graduation showed Rose beaming with pride beside her daughter, a moment Joseph had been robbed of witnessing, another piece of time he could never reclaim. Audrey moved to the window, needing space to process the seismic shift in her identity. 20 years of believing she was simply the daughter of a hardworking nurse had evaporated in an instant, replaced by the complicated reality of being a Salvini heir with all the privilege and danger that entailed. "We needed normal," Rose replied, softening slightly as she gestured around their modest apartment with its water stains on the ceiling and secondhand furniture. "We needed quiet, ordinary lives where Audrey could become whoever she wanted to be without the shadow of the Salvini name." Audrey glanced between her parents, piecing together the fragments of a history she'd never known existed. "So you're really my father?" she asked Joseph directly, studying his face with new intensity. "All these years, Mom said my father died before I was born." "In many ways, that wasn't a lie," Joseph answered, surprising both women with his honesty. "The man your mother loved, the one who dreamed of leaving everything behind to build a life with her, he did die, replaced by someone who could survive in my world." Rose moved toward the kitchen, needing distance from the intensity of the moment. "Would anyone like some coffee?" she asked, falling back on hospitality as a defense mechanism against the emotional tidal wave threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed life. 2 weeks after the shocking revelation, Audrey sat across from Joseph at his private table in the Golden Crown restaurant, no longer as a waitress, but as his daughter. The tension between them had softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity as they navigated this newfound relationship neither had prepared for. "I received your medical school application fee payments, but I can't accept them," Audrey said, sliding an envelope across the polished table. Her pride, inherited from both parents, wouldn't allow her to simply take his money despite her desperate financial situation. Joseph left the envelope untouched, studying the determination in his daughter's eyes. "It's not charity, Audrey. It's 20 years of birthdays, Christmases, and graduations that I missed," he explained, the regret in his voice genuine and raw. "My mom worked double shifts for years to give me a normal life," Audrey countered, her loyalty fierce and unwavering. "She's still paying off loans from nursing school while saving for my tuition. I won't dishonor her sacrifice by taking easy money now." The restaurant door swung open, and Joseph's expression shifted instantly from father to crime boss as his lieutenant approached with urgent news. "The Braddock family is moving on the West Side territory," the man whispered, unaware of Audrey's identity. Audrey watched this transformation with fascination and unease, seeing the dangerous reality her mother had sheltered her from. "Is this why she kept me away?" she asked after the man departed, gesturing to the subtle but unmistakable signs of Joseph's other life. "Your mother made the right choice," Joseph admitted, signaling for the check. "But circumstances have changed. The medical school tuition problem is just the beginning of what I can help with." The following day, Rose received a certified letter informing her that her student loans had been forgiven due to a clerical error. She crumpled the paper in her fist, knowing exactly who was responsible for this unwanted intervention into their carefully constructed lives. "You can't just erase 20 years by throwing money at us," Rose confronted Joseph that evening on the steps of his mansion, where she'd driven directly after her shift. Her nursing scrubs stood in stark contrast to the opulence surrounding them. Joseph guided her inside, away from potential watching eyes. "I'm not trying to buy forgiveness, Rose," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "I'm trying to give you both the security you deserve without changing who you are." The contrast between their worlds couldn't have been more stark. Rose's practical nurse's scrubs against the backdrop of Italian marble and priceless art. A life of service versus a life of power. Two paths that had diverged 20 years ago at the intersection of love and fear. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline glittered like a jewelry box of possibilities, a kingdom Joseph had built while Rose raised their daughter in the shadows. The city that had kept them apart now forced them together, their separate lives colliding with the force of tectonic plates. The mansion's interior told the story of a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. Pristine furniture sat unused in perfect rooms, expensive art, adorned walls no one ever admired, and silence echoed through spaces designed for a family that had never materialized. "You live alone in all this?" Rose asked, momentarily forgetting her anger as she glimpsed the emptiness of his existence. The question hung between them, loaded with 2 decades of separate choices and shared regret. Joseph's phone rang before he could answer, the screen lighting up with an urgent message that drained the color from his face. "Audrey's been followed from her evening class," he said, already moving toward the door, pulling Rose alongside him. "My security team just spotted Braddock's men tracking her back to your apartment." "This is exactly what I feared," Rose whispered, as they sped through the Chicago streets in Joseph's armored car. "Your enemy's learning about her, using her to get to you." The nightmare scenario she had protected their daughter from for 20 years was unfolding despite her precautions. Joseph gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'll send you both away tonight. New identities, new location, completely untraceable," he promised, already formulating plans to erase their existence. "Or you can come under my protection, where no one would dare touch what belongs to a Salvini." The Salvini family compound sprawled across 3 acres of heavily guarded lakefront property, a fortress disguised as a luxury estate. Rose and Audrey had reluctantly accepted Joseph's protection after the threat from the rival Braddock family became too dangerous to ignore. "This will be temporary," Rose insisted, as she unpacked their hastily gathered belongings in the guest house. Though spacious and elegant, it felt like a beautiful cage to a woman who had spent 20 years maintaining her independence from Joseph's world. Audrey adapted more quickly than her mother, fascinated by this glimpse into her father's life and the legacy that, whether she wanted it or not, was partially hers. "Have you always lived here?" she asked Joseph over breakfast on their 3rd morning. "I grew up in this house, though it's changed considerably since then," Joseph replied, watching his daughter absorb every detail with intelligent eyes that reminded him so much of his own. "My father ruled through fear, but I've built something more sophisticated. Legitimate businesses, political connections." Rose entered the dining room, her hospital ID badge clipped to her scrubs. "I appreciate the security detail, Joseph, but they cannot follow me onto hospital floors," she stated firmly, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "My patients deserve privacy." "The Braddocks have eyes everywhere," Joseph argued, concern etched on his face. "At least let my men drive you and maintain a perimeter." The tension between them was palpable. 2 decades of separate lives creating fundamentally different approaches to danger. That afternoon, while Rose was at work and Joseph attended to business, Audrey explored the mansion's east wing, discovering a library filled with first editions and rare manuscripts. She ran her fingers along leather-bound spines, finding unexpected common ground with the father she was just beginning to know. A leather-bound copy of Pablo Neruda's love sonnets caught her eye, the same collection her mother kept on her nightstand, its pages worn from years of reading. The coincidence sent a shiver down her spine, a tangible connection to the love story that had created her, then been severed before she was born. Outside the library windows, armed guards patrolled the manicured grounds, a stark reminder that this world of culture and refinement was built on a foundation of violence and power. Audrey wondered how many of these men knew who she was, the secret daughter suddenly thrust into the spotlight of a dangerous family legacy. "My grandmother's collection," Joseph explained, finding Audrey absorbed in a volume of Renaissance poetry. She believed education was the true path to power, not the family business my grandfather built. His voice carried a wistful quality that Audrey had never heard before. The peaceful moment shattered as Joseph's security chief burst in, his expression grave. "We've intercepted communications," he reported. "The Braddocks know about your daughter and her mother. They're planning to use them as leverage in the territory dispute." Joseph's transformation was immediate and terrifying. Gone was the contemplative father sharing family history, replaced by a man whose cold fury made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "Move them to the lake house tonight," he ordered. "Triple the security and tell no one, not even our own people." "I have an exam tomorrow," Audrey protested when informed of the plan. "And Mom has patients who depend on her. We can't just disappear because some rival of yours is making threats." Joseph paced the library, torn between his desire to protect his newly discovered family and his respect for the independent lives they'd built without him. 20 years ago, I let your mother make the decision to keep you safe," he finally said. "I won't make the same mistake twice." The lake house, though called such, was actually a remote compound in northern Wisconsin, accessible only by private road and protected by state-of-the-art security systems. Rose stood at the window, watching the sunset reflect off the water, as Audrey explored the rustic but luxurious interior. "He's trying to put us in a gilded cage," Rose whispered, when her daughter joined her. "I've spent your entire life making sure you could make your own choices, and now this." She gestured to the armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Audrey was silent for a long moment, processing everything that had happened since that fateful day at the restaurant. "Maybe we don't have to choose between his world and ours," she finally said, surprising her mother with her insight. "Maybe there's a middle path where we accept his protection without sacrificing who we are." 6 days at the lake house passed in tense isolation before Joseph arrived with news. "The immediate threat has been neutralized," he announced, the vague phrasing telling both women more than explicit details would have about what had transpired in Chicago during their absence. Rose watched him carefully, seeing both the man she had loved and the dangerous figure he had become. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said quietly. "This situation is forcing us to make decisions we're not prepared for." Joseph nodded, following her outside onto the dock where privacy from both security personnel and Audrey would allow for honest conversation. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and approaching winter as they stood side by side, looking out over the water. "I never believed your father's threats were real until the day you disappeared," Rose finally admitted, breaking the silence between them. "When you gave me money for the abortion, I realized your family's reputation wasn't exaggerated. The danger was real." Joseph flinched at her words, the pain of old wounds still fresh. "I gave you that money to buy time, Rose. Not because I wanted to end our child's life," he confessed. "I was searching for a way to stand up to my father, to protect both of you. By the time I discovered I was still pregnant, I was already in San Francisco," Rose continued, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. "I called to tell you about the supposed miscarriage because I knew it was the only way to keep our baby safe from your world." The revelation hung between them. 20 years of misunderstanding finally clarified in the crisp air above the still lake. "I would have found a way to protect you both," Joseph insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "My father's organization was different then, more violent, less stable." "And now?" Rose challenged, turning to face him directly for the first time. "What would happen to Audrey if your enemies discovered a Salvini heir who hasn't been raised in the family traditions?" Joseph had no answer that would satisfy her, the truth too complex and dangerous to articulate. "She has my name whether she uses it or not," he finally said, "and that means something in Chicago, for better or worse." The sliding door opened as Audrey joined them on the dock, her expression serious. "I've been thinking about medical school," she announced without preamble. "I still want to go, but I need to understand exactly what being your daughter means for my future." Joseph looked between the two women who should have been his family for the past 20 years, seeing the strength and resilience they had built without him. "It means whatever you want it to mean," he answered carefully. "The Salvini name can open doors or remain your secret." "And what about you and Mom?" Audrey asked boldly, addressing the unspoken tension that had been building since their reunion. "There's obviously still something between you despite everything." Rose flushed, embarrassed by her daughter's directness, while Joseph looked momentarily caught off guard. "Your mother made the right choice for you," he finally said. "She protected you from a life I wouldn't have wanted for my child either." "That doesn't answer my question," Audrey pressed, her persistence revealing her Salvini heritage more clearly than any DNA test could have. 20 years is a long time, but neither of you ever married anyone else." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with 2 decades of might-have-beens and paths not taken. Rose broke it first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some choices stay with you forever. They become the foundation you build your life upon, for better or worse." Joseph's phone rang, shattering the moment with harsh reality. The call was brief, his responses clipped and professional, but when he hung up, both women recognized the gravity in his expression. "The Braddocks have escalated beyond what I anticipated," he said. "We can't stay here. We need to move tonight." The setting sun cast long shadows across the dock, turning the tranquil lake into a canvas of crimson and gold that belied the danger closing in around them. Rose instinctively moved closer to Audrey, the protective instinct that had guided her choices for 20 years, still her primary compass. Joseph watched the subtle movement, understanding flickering in his eyes. This was what he had missed. The countless moments of ordinary love that couldn't be purchased or commanded. His empire of power and fear suddenly seemed hollow compared to what Rose had built alone. A relationship founded on trust, sacrifice, and unconditional love. The caravan of black SUVs moved swiftly through the darkness, headed toward an undisclosed location Joseph assured would be secure. Rose sat beside Audrey in the middle vehicle, watching her daughter stare out the window at the passing countryside with worried eyes. "We should be at the hospital," Rose said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. "My shift starts in 4 hours, and Audrey has exams tomorrow." The normalcy they had fought so hard to maintain was slipping away with each mile. Joseph glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his expression grim. "The hospital received a bomb threat specifically mentioning the cardiac ward where you work," he explained. "It wasn't real, but it was a message meant for me. They know exactly where to find you." The convoy suddenly screeched to a halt as a tree blocked the narrow forest road ahead. Joseph's hand went immediately to his weapon, eyes scanning the dense woods surrounding them. "Stay in the car," he ordered, voice leaving no room for argument. Rose reached for Audrey's hand, squeezing it tightly as they watched Joseph confer with his security team. "Whatever happens, stay down and follow my lead," she whispered, the protective instinct she'd honed for 20 years kicking into high gear. The first bullet shattered the driver's side window of the lead SUV, followed immediately by a coordinated attack from the forest on both sides. Joseph dove back into their vehicle, using his body to shield Rose and Audrey as bullets peppered the reinforced exterior. "Drive," he shouted to his driver, who slammed the vehicle into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel road. The other SUVs provided covering fire as they executed a precise retreat maneuver that spoke of extensive training and experience with such ambushes. Audrey pressed herself against the floor, eyes wide with terror, as the reality of her father's world crashed into her peaceful existence. "Is this what your life is always like?" she gasped, as their vehicle lurched back down the road they had just traveled. "Only when someone thinks they can take what's mine," Joseph replied, checking his weapon before reaching for the satellite phone secured in the console. His call was brief and coded, but both Rose and Audrey understood he was mobilizing reinforcements. The firefight ended as abruptly as it had begun, the attackers melting back into the forest rather than pursuing the retreating convoy. "That wasn't meant to succeed," Joseph muttered, more to himself than to the others. It was a message, or worse, a distraction. His phone rang immediately, confirming his worst fears. "Sir, there's been an explosion at your downtown office," his lieutenant reported, voice tight with controlled panic. "Emergency services are responding, but early reports suggest multiple casualties." Joseph's face revealed nothing, but his knuckles whitened around the phone. "Take us to Lakeside Memorial," he instructed his driver, surprising both Rose and Audrey. "The attack on the office means they don't know where we are. The hospital will be safe for now, and they'll need all available medical personnel." The emergency room was chaos when they arrived, doctors and nurses rushing to treat victims of the explosion. Rose immediately grabbed a set of scrubs from the supply closet, her instincts as a healthcare provider overriding all other concerns. "I can help too," Audrey insisted, following her mother's lead. "I've completed 3 years of pre-med. I know basic triage procedures." The determination in her eyes mirrored Joseph's own, revealing her heritage more clearly than any DNA test could have. As they worked alongside the overwhelmed hospital staff, a pattern emerged in the injuries. Most of the victims were not Joseph's men, but ordinary office workers, cleaning staff, and civilians who happened to be in the wrong place. They weren't targeting my organization, Joseph realized with growing horror. They were making a statement about collateral damage. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, he had justified his actions by claiming to insulate innocents from the violence of his world, yet here were dozens of ordinary Chicagoans bleeding because of a vendetta against him. In the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency room, the carefully constructed walls between his family business and civilian life crumbled. Rose moved with practiced efficiency between patients, her hands steady despite the chaos, occasionally meeting Joseph's gaze across the crowded space. No words passed between them, but something fundamental had shifted. They were partners again for the first time in 20 years, fighting together against the consequences of choices made long ago. 3 days after the attack, Joseph stood in the hospital corridor watching Rose and Audrey through the window of the doctor's lounge where they had finally collapsed from exhaustion. Their tireless work had saved dozens of lives, earning respect from the entire medical team who had no idea of their connection to the man allegedly responsible for the violence. "The Braddock family patriarch is requesting a meeting," Joseph's lieutenant informed him quietly, keeping a respectful distance from the sleeping women. "He claims this has escalated beyond his original intentions and wants to negotiate." Joseph nodded, decision made before the question was fully articulated. Arrange it for tomorrow at neutral ground, the old cathedral downtown, he instructed, his eyes never leaving Rose and Audrey. And make sure our federal contacts understand that civilian casualties were not my doing. The meeting with Braddock was tense but productive, two old enemies finding common ground in their mutual desire to end bloodshed that had spiraled beyond control. Your daughter and her mother must be acknowledged publicly as under Salvini protection, the rival boss insisted. Otherwise, this truce means nothing. That decision isn't mine to make, Joseph replied, surprising both Braddock and himself with his honesty. They've built lives independent of my world, and I won't force them into the spotlight against their will. The solution, when it came, was Rose's idea. A charitable foundation established in Audrey's name to support medical education for disadvantaged students. This gives her Salvini protection without Salvini notoriety, Rose explained, as they finalized the paperwork in Joseph's downtown apartment. The Audrey Bennett Medical Scholarship Fund, Joseph read from the incorporation documents, approval evident in his voice, funded by anonymous donors, but with the implicit understanding throughout Chicago that it falls under Salvini protection. Audrey looked between her parents, seeing the mutual respect that had survived 20 years of separation. I still want to be a doctor, not a mob princess, she clarified, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. This foundation lets me acknowledge my heritage without being defined by it. As spring arrived, bringing new life to Chicago's parks and lakefront, the fragile family they had formed began to find its balance. Joseph purchased a brownstone near the hospital where Rose worked, establishing a neutral territory where all three could meet without the shadows of his mansion or the constraints of Rose's small apartment. Medical school acceptance letters came today, Audrey announced one evening, as they shared dinner in the brownstone's elegant kitchen. I got into Northwestern and Johns Hopkins. Her achievements were her own, earned through years of hard work rather than family connections. Joseph couldn't contain his pride, though he tried to temper his reaction to match Rose's more measured response. Whichever you choose, the foundation will cover everything, he assured her. Your focus should be on becoming the best doctor you can be. Actually, Audrey began hesitantly, setting down her fork, I'm considering deferring for a year. The statement caught both parents by surprise, their expressions prompting her to continue quickly. I want to work with the foundation, help establish protocols for selecting scholarship recipients. Rose studied her daughter carefully, seeing the determination that had always defined her. This isn't about the scholarships, she said gently. You want time to understand your father's world before you commit to your own path. Is that so wrong? Audrey challenged, glancing between her parents. For 20 years, half my identity was hidden from me. I need to understand where I come from before I can truly decide who I want to become. Joseph remained silent, emotions warring within him, pride at his daughter's desire to know him battling with fear of what that knowledge might bring. My world isn't something you can experience temporarily, he finally said. Once people associate you with the Salvini name, that connection never disappears. The discussion continued late into the night, three people navigating the complicated terrain of family, identity, and the shadows of the past. By morning, they had reached a compromise. Audrey would attend Johns Hopkins in the fall, but would spend the summer learning about the legitimate businesses Joseph had built, while the foundation would become a family project they could share regardless of distance. You've given her something I never could, Rose admitted to Joseph as they watched Audrey graduate with honors that June. A connection to her past that will help her build her future. The admission cost her pride, but acknowledged a truth she had finally come to accept. The prestigious Johns Hopkins Medical School auditorium buzzed with excitement as families gathered for the graduation ceremony. In the front row, Joseph Salvini sat beside Rose Bennett, their hands occasionally brushing in a gesture that spoke of reconciliation and something deeper that had slowly rekindled over the years. Dr. Audrey Bennett, the dean announced, and cheers erupted from their section as Audrey crossed the stage to receive her diploma. Her journey had not been easy, balancing rigorous medical training with occasional trips home to help manage the foundation that now supported dozens of aspiring healthcare workers from disadvantaged backgrounds. Joseph beamed with pride, remembering the frightened young waitress from the Golden Crown restaurant who had unwittingly changed the course of all their lives with one simple observation about a tattoo. The constellation pattern still circled his wrist, though now it was matched by a smaller version on Audrey's ankle, her graduation gift to herself. She has your determination, Joseph whispered to Rose as they watched their daughter accept additional honors for her research in pediatric oncology. And your heart. The compliment was sincere, acknowledging that Rose's choices had shaped Audrey into someone far better than the Salvini influence alone would have produced. Rose smiled, the years of tension and fear finally settling into a peaceful acceptance of their unusual family dynamic. "She has your strategic mind," she countered. The way she organized that fundraising campaign last year was pure Salvini diplomacy. The changes in Joseph himself were perhaps the most profound of all. While still heading his organization, he had accelerated the family's transition toward legitimacy, using his influence to establish medical clinics in underserved Chicago neighborhoods and gradually distancing himself from the more dangerous aspects of his empire. "I've been offered the chief resident position at Chicago Memorial," Audrey revealed during their celebration dinner that evening. "I'd be working in pediatric oncology, starting this fall." The announcement surprised both parents, who had assumed she would remain on the East Coast to complete her residency. "Are you sure about returning to Chicago?" Rose asked carefully, understanding all the implications of her daughter's choice. "Your reputation there will always be complicated by your connection to your father." Audrey nodded, her decision clearly well considered. "That's precisely why I need to be there," she explained. "The foundation is making real difference, and I want to be hands-on with the scholarship recipients starting their medical careers in our hometown." Joseph watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, recognizing the strength that allowed her to embrace both sides of her heritage without being consumed by either. "The Salvini name will open doors," he acknowledged, "but your skill will keep them open." "Actually," Audrey said with a smile, "I've decided to use both names professionally. Dr. Audrey Bennett Salvini." Her declaration represented the final reconciliation of her divided identity, claiming both her mother's careful protection and her father's powerful legacy. Later that evening, as Audrey chatted with former classmates at the hotel bar, Joseph and Rose found themselves alone on the terrace overlooking the Baltimore harbor. The years had softened their edges, turning youthful passion into something more enduring and complex. A passing boat's lights danced across the water's surface, momentarily illuminating Rose's face with the same golden glow Joseph remembered from their first summer together. The constellation tattoo peeking from beneath her sleeve caught the light, a permanent reminder of promises made and broken under different stars. Behind them, through the glass doors of the hotel, they could see Audrey laughing with friends, her gestures animated as she told some story, unaware of her parents watching, unaware of how this moment of normalcy was the greatest gift they could have given her despite their complicated past. "She's remarkable," Joseph said, watching the lights reflect on the water. "Everything I could have hoped for in a daughter, and nothing I deserved after how things ended between us." The admission came easier now, years of co-parenting having taught him a humility his younger self had lacked. Rose turned toward him, studying the face she had once known better than her own. "We both made mistakes," she acknowledged, her voice gentle in the evening air. "But protecting her was never one of mine, even if the method wasn't what either of us would have chosen." The constellation tattoo on Joseph's wrist caught the moonlight as he reached for Rose's hand, a gesture that had become increasingly natural over the past 5 years. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we'd found another way?" he asked, the question that had haunted him for 2 decades finally spoken aloud. "Every day," Rose admitted, her fingers intertwining with his. "But then we wouldn't have the daughter we have, shaped by both worlds instead of trapped in either." The wisdom of her perspective struck Joseph anew, reminding him why he had never stopped loving her despite 20 years of separation. Their relationship had evolved gradually, from cautious co-parents to reluctant allies to friends, and now to something neither could quite define, but both treasured. The foundation had given them a shared purpose beyond Audrey herself, bringing them together regularly, even as they maintained their separate lives. "I'm retiring next year," Joseph announced suddenly, the decision crystallizing in that moment, though it had been forming for some time. Turning everything over to legitimate management and stepping away from the organization completely. The declaration hung between them, heavy with implication. Rose studied him carefully, searching for the truth behind his words. "And then what?" she asked. The question simple, but loaded with 2 decades of complicated history and 5 years of careful rebuilding. Joseph's answer came in the form of a small velvet box he'd carried in his pocket throughout Audrey's graduation ceremony. "And then, if you're willing, we try again. The right way this time," he said, opening it to reveal not a diamond but a gold pendant, bearing the same constellation pattern as their tattoos. "Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, because your support is important for me to continue here.